is going to be Mr. John Mulligan, who currently serves as the Deputy Director for the National Counterterrorism Center. John is the first Deputy Director to come from the National Security Agency, where most recently he served as the Associate Deputy Director. He has been with NCTC since March of 2015. So, Mr. Mulligan, I turn the floor over to you.
Thank you, Janice. Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here with you today, and thank you very much, Janice. I really enjoyed hearing that panel speak because of the fact it is so relevant to the counterterrorism mission. And before I say anything further, my first message to you is, to those of you who have helped us in the past, you have my profound thanks. Due to your efforts, we have been able to forestall a counterterrorism threat against the United States that has been existent for over 2 decades. And I also want to thank you for what you're going to do to help us in the future, because this threat is not going away. In the time that we have today, I want to cover 3 primary areas. First, I want to talk to you a little bit about what the current terrorism landscape looks about. And please forgive me, I'm a little bit of a walker back and forth. The second thing I want to talk to you a little bit about is how terrorists are operating currently in cyberspace and how we expect them to be operating in cyberspace in the future. And then the third piece I want to cover is to talk to you a little bit about how important data access and data flow is to the counterterrorism mission, and how that too is currently evolving and how we anticipate we can optimize it. So, starting out, the terrorism threat landscape. This is a particularly well-informed audience, so I'm not going to have to give you the entire history of how things have been evolving in that space. But needless to say, what we have seen in the last, let's say, 4+ years, is we have seen the rise of what I would call the modern terrorist structure. We have seen ISIS, which was literally born out of Al-Qaeda, and it is an organization that is populated by a younger demographic, one that is much more comfortable in a digital era, and one that is much more global in its outlook and its mobility. And what that has done to the terrorist threat is that it has made it a much less predictable environment. We tell our senior leaders all the time that we operate in an environment right now in which we have more threats coming from more actors operating out of more locations than at any time since 9/11. And it's probably more than ever. Where we stand right now is the fact that we have had probably close to about 40,000 foreign fighters from about 120 countries who have made their way to Iraq and Syria over the last five or so years. And now the caliphate, which they stood up there, the territorial control that they are maintaining is shrinking. It is being diminished on a daily basis by a coalition of over 60 nations that are collectively taking control of that territory. And what that has done to the organization, ISIS in particular, is that whereas they had a narrative, a sort of very important strategic message that said, our success is inevitable, it's caused them to adapt that narrative. And now their narrative is more, this is a global movement. We know that we are going to experience defeats over time, but we are going to succeed ultimately. When they initially stood up the caliphate, as many of you know, they very aggressively attempted to market themselves as a global movement. They stood up 8 branches globally in the period from 2014 to the middle of 2015. And across those various entities, we have seen varying degrees of success. Some are operating in environments and operating with personnel in which they have a fair degree of technical acumen, a robust group of actors, and they have had some degrees of success. Others have been operating in environments in which there is very strong state security and stabilization forces, and they have not had that degree of success. So it would be fair to say that the organization is currently in flux. In our messaging to senior leadership, what we have communicated is just because we are going to be able, we anticipate, to considerably shrink and defeat their physical stronghold, it does not diminish their external threat globally. It doesn't take a lot of land or resource for an individual operating in Raqqa or some other point to communicate with a willing and potentially capable actor anywhere in the globe and induce them to commit a terrorist act. If there is a trend that we have seen over time, it is that they have moved less and less from complex operations that we saw in 9/11, that we saw in Paris, France, that we saw in Brussels, Belgium, more and more into the types of attacks that we saw recently in London on the Westminster Bridge, where one day an individual goes out, rents a car, and within 82 seconds mows people down, jumps out, kills a person, and attempts to, again, create as much mayhem as he can. What is really unique about ISIS is the fact that they have a deep understanding of the linkage between the media world, particularly social media, and the operational world. And they have very successfully been able to use media to amplify the effects of their operational activities. And that is a very much of a modern construct, one that has been increasingly embraced by others. Al-Qaeda, more and more, has taken on ISIS behaviors that they decried initially because the success of those behaviors is not deniable for them. So that's the overall operating environment. We don't anticipate that those kinds of lone actor threats are going to diminish in any point in the near future. When we characterize the threat to the homeland, the primary vector is through homegrown violent extremists who have been radicalized online. That takes me to the second piece, which is ISIS and Al-Qaeda operations in cyberspace. So, as I stated, the one point that they really achieved a degree of initial notoriety was on their embrace of social media, their understanding of how social media can help them recruit, how it can help them radicalize, and how it can help them operationalize those potential actors who might be physically displaced from the organization. The second piece is that they understand that the broad range of commercial applicability allows them to conduct global operations. They can conduct financial transactions. They can facilitate logistical movements. They can do funding. They can teach people how to operate. They operate in the media space. I mean, the bottom line is they have successfully embraced what we would consider to be a modern management model. They take folks who are broadly dispersed, they flatten the organization, they give them degrees of responsibility and accountability, and they let them display their initiative. They follow the mantra that when you fail, fail fast, and we'll try and adapt a different model. It's been fascinating to watch, very problematic for us. We initially experienced some degrees of success because of the fact that they had a predilection, not surprisingly, for US social media platforms. They did that because of the fact that our platforms were global in nature, our platforms were easy to use, and our platforms were such that they were very effective in their ability to canvass, communicate, find those individuals who were susceptible to their messaging, and then slowly rope those individuals into their sphere of influence. If I could characterize to you how they initially would operate, it would be that they would be on widely publicly available platforms, and once they made contact with those individuals, they would then migrate conversations into more secure messaging platforms, which is the second piece of this cyber operational activity, and that is the fact that they have a lot of thought leaders. Those thought leaders are fairly conversant in modern technology. Some of them are very conversant in modern technology, and they have been able to embrace and use and utilize and migrate through a number of secure messaging platforms. The challenge that we have within the United States and our global partnership is that, again, it's a very dynamic operating environment, and there is not necessarily uniformity of behavior. Gosh, that would be very helpful if they were all behaving, the various branches were behaving in the same way, but unfortunately they're not. So you see broad degrees of variance, broad degrees of, if you will, operational competencies, and so whereas some of our partners have particular success in disrupting these communications activities and these logistical and infrastructure activities. In other areas, we are particularly challenged. With regard to cyber operations, they have been aspirational in terms of discussing cyber activities almost from the start. And once again, some thought leaders are particularly facile. What we have seen practically is that it's been largely confined, their activities, to doxing, in which they go out, find available information, some low-level hacking, a lot of it basically exploiting low-hanging fruit, and then generating that PII information in terms of kill lists, generally related to security, military personnel, and trying to encourage others to conduct attacks against those individuals. So that's pretty much been what we've seen. We've seen some low-level web defacements, but again, nothing particularly substantial. The cautionary note that I would add to that is that in every other area in which there is relevant commercial applicability, they have consistently shown an ability to evolve capabilities over time. I'll give you an example. We saw the way that they started working with unmanned aerial systems. They initially started using them in very, very simple ways, not unlike the way that we see a lot of hobbyists. They were using GoPros hooked up to drones, and they were doing battlefield damage assessments. They were doing some crude ISR, and over time we have seen their increasing capability of weaponizing UASs and developing competencies in terms of potentially arming them and employing them as delivery systems. We should not make the same mistake in terms of underestimating their ability to, again, adapt their own cyber capabilities. It's a very cost-effective way of doing business. It's a very effective way of demonstrating global reach. So we can anticipate that although they have not yet demonstrated the nation-state level competencies in this regard, they will continue to work relentlessly against it. Not unlike the same way we have seen them work the airline threat. You know, within their mentality, this has always been something, ever since 9/11, that was probably in their minds the most successful terror attack in history. So when folks start talking to us about the airline threat, my response, and the response of our organization, is they've never stopped working that threat. It has enormous attraction and appeal. The idea that they could disrupt our systems, our networks, our functionality holds similar, if you will, similar desire. And so we should not underestimate their aspirations in this regard over time. With regard to the ways in which we, and I'll move to my third point, with regard to the ways in which we are evolving to address their competencies and capabilities, I can't stress enough how much data access and data flow is critical to both the current counterterrorism posture of the United States and its allies, and the way that it's going to play into the future. Because of the fact that we have this really difficult, dispersed, largely, potentially, globally unidentifiable pool of potential operatives, we really need to work together cooperatively to share data as efficiently as possible. One of the reasons our organization, the National Counterterrorism Center, was stood up after 9/11 was that the 9/11 Commission assessed that, wow, there were pools of information that might have given us deeper insights into how the 9/11 attackers were going to operate. If we are able to fuse that information more efficiently, we're going to have a greater prospect of being able to stop it. That rule, that mentality, that probability has not changed. What has changed is the fact that, again, there is much more global disbursement of communications capabilities, of interconnectedness among the various terrorism communities. So that has made it a much more challenging environment. Within our center, we are responsible for TIDE, the Terrorist Identities Data Mart environment. Many of you are probably familiar with it. It's basically the classified database by which all of the information that is derived from the intel community comes in, and we generate a database, and then parts of that database are then distilled to inform watch listing, to inform no-fly lists. It goes to the Terrorist Screening Center, who, working in partnership with many of our global partners, are able to share that information with them. What we have found over time is that, guess what? We were very much focused, not surprisingly, on name-based identities. Well, name-based identities are extremely difficult in terms of trying to assure with precision that the identity intelligence you are generating is accurate and applicable and high confidence with relationship to a particular suspect or actor. And so where we are evolving over time, not surprisingly, is into a more biometrically based system. But that, again, requires that we have processes in place to take in greater amounts of data, to have processes in which we can share that data with confidence within, if you will, policy, privacy, and legal frameworks. In an ideal world, we would be able to take a lot of the data together, very efficiently aggregate it, run a correlation engine, and say with great confidence, this is how, or this is the terrorist identity, this is the individual, this is the probable course of action we're going to identify. Unfortunately, perhaps not unfortunately, every data stream has legal and policy constraints attached to it. And within the United States, and seeing our colleagues sitting here, the CIOs discussing, again, the interworking relationship, I can assure you that in the counterterrorism world, the United States is an exemplar of how different parts of their federal system work together. Many of our international partners do not enjoy the close working relationships that the terrorism mission has compelled us to forge together. And we need to be very conscious of the fact that we are modeling behaviors that are likely to be adapted by these partners over time. So what we're trying to do is create an environment in which there is an ability for us to access each other's information and with the appropriate degree of accountability and responsibility so that there is confidence that the laws and policies and civil rights of the citizens of each of these nations are being respected. This is going to be a big challenge for us, not just within our federal system, but within if you will, the global counterterrorism partnership over time. It's just a fact that we live in a world in which our citizens are much more mobile, much more global, and that therefore we are going to find individuals conducting terrorist operations in countries outside of their point of origin. That's just how the situation is evolving right now. With regard to the entire cloud-based infrastructure, gotta tell you, from an NCTC point of view, we are so completely in. We view it as absolutely critical to our success. If I go back, I fortunately was not at NCTC at the beginning, but what I have seen over time is that the organization necessarily had to stand up a number of point-to-point agreements to gain access to all the data streams that it needed to employ to effectively conduct the counterterrorism mission. Over time, we've been moving more and more into interagency agreements, addressing multiple data streams. But once we get into a cloud environment in which data is tagged, where there is complete confidence in the folks who are the owners of the data, that it is being employed in a legal and safe manner, we are going to have even more success in that regard. So the appetite for data is not changing. It's just going to be something that we are going to have to adapt to over time.